Senna obviously was well known, and the European viewpoint of it was far different than the American viewpoint. There's a lot of what I learned from Roger that still carries with me today, and everything that my company is involved in. We spoke, and he was very, very much made it very clear that his physical fitness in the car needed to be on top, including his neck. There's less emphasis on the pit stops. I think in regard to NASCAR, there's massive emphasis on that. All components of racing, from the muscular ability to reaction times to cognitive processing skills, are diminished the more fluid that is lost. A lot of them are with Scott Dixon, I will admit, and those I definitely can't repeat, or as his wife might listen to this podcast. And we
Yo, it's your boy AMG Denz, aka Denzel Clarkson, and I'm back home again in Indiana as we explore the depths of motorsport on episode 8 of our summer shutdown series. So we've got a very important guest. He's the first ever fitness trainer to be hired by an IndyCar team and the CEO and president of the very successful PITFIT training center. I'm very proud to introduce Jim Leo. Jim, how are you keeping today?
I'm good. I appreciate you guys reaching out and being on your show. How are you guys doing?
Yeah, we're all good as well, Jim. Super fascinated to learn more about what you do and just generally life in the fitness aspect of motor racing, since I think it's such an understated part of, the modern game, and there's so many facets to it as well, So
Right.
Just to kind of open it up as well, Jim, what have you been up to during the summer so far?
Well, it's been a little hectic. This has been a extremely hectic year in a good way. We opened up our second location in Charlotte, North Carolina, officially January 1st. So we have a facility there. We've been active with our drivers now down there and here in Indianapolis, along with our online coaching platform that's worldwide. And then I have been hired by Brian Herta Autosport in a sports car series my job is to extract, carry to, and carry from the car Robert Wickens, a driver who was paralyzed several years ago in IndyCar and now races in a hand-controlled car in a sports car series. So I go to the races and we practice driver changes. I pick him up, get him out of the car, transport him, and then I bring him back to the car and do his belts and everything like that. Boy, it's been a little crazy. We've done our team has been over in Europe doing some work with Jack Crawford, a young Red Bull Formula 3 driver, doing some track support. And I don't know, there's a lot. I did the F1 test with Colton Herta with McLaren not long ago, and I'll be doing that again at Barcelona in September. We're not even to September yet, so it's been a little bit crazy.
I could imagine, Jim. Like, there's so many different things you mentioned there as well, which we can explore in this episode. But it's a very exciting time, and I'm so happy as well to hear about the Charlotte division as well opening up as well. It's such an exciting time. So let's get into it, Jim. We briefly glanced over you becoming like actually the first fitness trainer to be hired by IndyCar team, more specifically the PacWest Racing Group, overseeing both the IndyCar and Indy Lights drivers as well. For our listeners, Jim, could you kind of give them a kind of insight into the path that you took to get to that stage of your early career? We know that you were a graduate of the Eastern Michigan University with a Bachelor's of Science in Exercise Physiology. But how did that all tie into your first initial role in the motorsports world?
Really, it's all because of Roger Penske. When I was first out of school, I worked for corporate wellness at a diesel engine plant that Roger owned in Detroit, Michigan. And we had a full-time staff, and I began working with his IndyCar team in Reading, Pennsylvania. I would fly back and forth and work with them, and nobody was really doing this at the time. And there wasn't a whole lot of information out there. I joke around with the younger generation. I said, believe it or not, there was a time when the internet didn't exist, and the resources were very limited at what you could find. You could certainly find information on working with, a baseball player or a tennis player or a rugby athlete by reading books, but there wasn't a whole lot of information out there for racing. So I began with the pit crew, designed a program for them, built a facility in their shop in Reading, Pennsylvania, would fly back and forth. And then from there, I saw an opportunity to do something that I didn't really know what was available. I really didn't know what I was getting into, but I knew that at this point in my young career that I wanted to be at the forefront of something innovative. And I left. I began working with other teams as well. Started my own company, and then I relocated to Indianapolis and I was hired full time by PacWest Racing at the time in the kart series, which is now IndyCar. So I was the first ever person in that position, but a lot of it came from obviously the connections made through Roger Penske and in racing to this day that I still maintain. I'm still very close to many members of the original Penske employees that I worked with, good Lord, almost 30 years ago. So it's been a long journey, but it's definitely been a good one.
Absolutely there, Jim. It's really fascinating just to kind of see the start of it. And just generally, as well, you mentioned there was a time where, there wasn't so much emphasis on driver fitness, and it was almost in the 90s anyway, somewhat of like a rock and roll kind of era for drivers, still smoking cigarettes, still drinking booze, and the question I wanted to kind of segue as well there, Jim, was, with the earlier role you had, there was a huge emphasis on, the wellness programs, introducing new measures such as a cholesterol screening, having consultations with the team chef as well to try and, introduce healthy performance-based foods too. But for yourself at the time, Jim, like what was the biggest challenge in trying to really introduce these performance enhancing measures, because like with a modern day racing as well, we know that, modern day Indy cars have no power steering. The drivers have to work consistently on managing the weight and physical fatigue. The cars also produce a phenomenal amount of, like downforce, which means the drivers require a lot of upper body strength to deal with the G-forces. And then you throw all of that in, then you got the heat that's generated in the cockpit by these cars as well, with all the electronics, and some teams not even running a water bottle, for some of the drivers. So how easy was it even back in the 90s to kind of introduce this as like a concept, to people for the first time?
Well, I think it was challenging because nobody was really doing it. The only place you could find any semblance of physical conditioning was, I think Mark Martin was known for training weights back in, early in the 90s or 80s or whatever. And Senna obviously was well known, and the European viewpoint of it was far different than the American viewpoint. And I remember early in my career in 95, I think I was asked to, Roger asked me to work with Al Unser Jr., who one of his IndyCar drivers. And, Al was a really nice guy, but there's a book about him now. He battled a lot of demons with addictions and things, but not somebody you would consider very healthy. And my first encounter with him, I thought, well, this is it. This is the game changer. This is the defining moment. This is Al Unser Jr. I'm the guy that's going to make a change. And when I first met him, in the span of 30 seconds, he lit up a cigarette, opened a can of beer, and started eating some sort of Velveeta cheese burrito unhealthy thing as he's talking, all enthusiastic about this project. And I was in awe. I was in there in a motorhome with the guy smoking, drinking on race weekend, and eating bad. And he clearly was appeasing Roger to meet with me, but it didn't really go any further. So that was pretty much how things were for the longest time. But I think the thing that eventually changed was the fact that if you remember, in the 90s, there started to be this influx of European drivers, Formula One refugees of sorts, who were making the transition over to IndyCar. And when that happened, these drivers, Alex Zanardi and Jill DeFerrin and such, they were very successful and they were very fit. Personally, when I was hired by PacWest, our two drivers were Mark Blundell, who had driven for McLaren, and Mauricio Gugelmin, who another Formula One driver, and then a young Indy Lights driver, a French kid named Didier Andre. And they had been used to the training as part of their upbringing in racing. And so for them, it was a matter of, okay, you know, who's the physio, who's the trainer? And so right away, I had a captive audience right away. That was a turning point for sure. But by far, these drivers that came over.
Hi there, Jim. I think we've lost you. Your audio might start coming back in. Well, I'm glad that you're back anyways. So, Jim,
Well,
like before we... Sorry.
I don't know where I left off there. I don't know how much you caught or where we were.
We were just in the very interesting part. We were talking about like the difference, you know, in the approach of some of the European drivers, and also how in F1, I guess that culture had started to develop, but in America, the concept, you know, of having a physio, having like, you know, like a personal fitness trainer, still quite a new and like fresh concept to most.
It was, and it was something, you know, it was something definitely. It was new. There were some drivers that had trainers in the past, but no team had really stepped up like PacWest had. And, you know, from there, these drivers started winning. They did well. I knew going in with this contract with PacWest Racing, I knew my position was subject to meeting a budget, and I knew that in racing at this point, not critical enough that I couldn't be sacked at any time. I just had this feeling that it wasn't there yet, and so I signed a 2-year contract with PacWest. It was guaranteed, but I had no intention of renewing that contract at the end of 2 years. In the time that I was working with them, I was laying the groundwork to go off and even though I had started PITFIT before PacWest, it was somewhat dormant at that point. But while people were asking me for their help, I would help a little bit on the side, but it wasn't anything for monetary gain. I was just laying the groundwork. And you know, when the contract expired, we renewed it at a much lower cost. I was able to go off and do whatever I wanted with the team. And then literally 4 months later, the whole team went under.
Wow.
Yeah. And a lot of people lost their job, but I knew, you know, it wasn't like I was in a position like a technical director or an engineer or a front end mechanic where I could just bounce to another team. This was something that only this team was really saw the value in it. In the beginning, and luckily once the transition occurred, it wasn't that big of a loss. I had already signed with other drivers and such, and it kind of picked up from there. So that's kind of how it started in the beginning. But then, you know, the thing that really helped, back to what changed the attitude of Americans, you started seeing even people like, I remember Bobby Rahal lost a bunch of weight to race. He saw that he had to be lighter to make a difference. And that just kind of continued. And it got to be the point where fewer and fewer drivers were not fit, as opposed to, you know, today, literally every driver is going to be super fit, all different levels. Back then it was rare. Now it's the other way around. The driver that doesn't train, you can see they're usually not as competitive, and you know, that they're criticized for not taking the racing as serious.
Absolutely, Jim. And this is the thing that we always talk about on the podcast too, like the fine margins and having to physically and also mentally condition yourself for the levels of racing that we see these days too, when there's so much at stake. You know, there's a lot of money involved these days as well. And also there's lots of opportunities for drivers, if they do well in IndyCar, to make a transition into Formula One. And vice versa.
Right.
Some Formula One drivers, they've not had like the easiest time in Formula One. They've migrated into IndyCar, like you mentioned. And for them, this is a new opportunity to kind of like hone a sport, which, you know, can be rewarding, but definitely requires that attention to detail, that level of commitment to training and personal fitness too. So absolutely. One other thing I wanted to touch on as well, Jim, you mentioned the very legendary and historic Roger Penske. He doesn't even need an introduction either because of what he's achieved so much, and also the kind of stable that is Penske racing. Like we often see in modern day kind of IndyCar at the moment, you'll see Newgarden, Will Power, and McLaughlin all in the top 5, usually most times, if not all the time. And now there's a kind of like sustained emphasis on other series as well, like the V8 supercars in Australia, and also I think a joint kind of venture they have with the World Endurance kind of prototype racing series as well, which is so interesting. But to kind of take a DeLorean time machine a bit back to the 90s there, Jim, you also kind of there with Penske, with Roger, in those like years of 93 and I think even 94, there was a really dominant year for the team where I believe they took 16 out of 16 wins and actually took an Indy 500 win as well. Could you talk maybe on that as well and some of the new concepts, specifically trial during that kind of period as well? Hi there, Jim. I didn't know if you could catch the question.
You had asked about with Roger Penske. Yeah, I think one thing that I was in awe when I began working for Roger with his Detroit diesel manufacturing plant in the wellness center. There was already, he had turned that company around from losing money, bought it a year later, was making money. He painted the entire plant. It was very clean. The attitudes of the workers were strong. I mean, he turned an entire organization around, in the manufacturing. And you thought that was as high level as far as the prestige and the way that he efficiently ran his company and the respect that his employees had. Then I got involved in his racing organization, and it blew everything else out of the water. That was his pride and joy. And every worker at Penske, you did it the Penske way. There were no round pegs or anything like that. Square hole, whatever. He just went by his way of going, and it was just an amazingly efficient system, the way that it was run from top to bottom. And it's hard to find that in any organization where the leadership is so strong that literally employees would bow down, would walk on fire for this person. But he was just that amazing as a leader. To this day, it just still blows me away, his energy and his foresight into how to stay on top of competition. So that was amazing, and it really left an imprint on me in the way that I try to do things. And I obviously I'll strive to be like Roger Penske, and I'm not Roger Penske, so I do the best I can and to fit with my own system. But there's a lot of what I learned from Roger that still carries with me today, and everything that my company is involved in.
Absolutely, Jim. And I think, what you said there as well speaks so highly of the standards that Roger had, the success that he's achieved as well, and not only just IndyCar or kart racing, but other kind of things he's ventured into business-wise as well. And like you mentioned, he's a stand-up individual, very astute when it comes to, achieving the maximum potential and like enforcing performance at all levels as well. And as a smooth segue as well, Jim, we'd be remiss, if we had you on the show and we didn't talk about another successful, business that, you were the founder of, you're the pioneer of in that sense as well, the very successful fitness center in PITFIT. In fact, funnily enough, Jim, we actually interviewed one of the lead drivers in the W Series, Sabra Cook last week, very talented hot driver. And, she's kind of given us kind of an insight into the road of rehabilitation, through your amazing training centers as well. And kind of like segueing into it, Jim, the question we wanted to ask you is, could you walk us through the inception of PitFit itself in its early years and how you managed to expand the client base, beyond this IndyCar customers and now into the realms of NASCAR, the National Hot Rod Association, and even, I believe, a site in the UK as well?
Well, it's it's just ambition and a vision to affect and impact every racing car driver in the world. And the only way to do that is to leave no stone unturned in your pursuit. If you early on, I realized that being dependent on one series would potentially have a recipe for disaster. If things were to go wrong in one series, if there were some economic issues or something were to occur that I couldn't I didn't have the insight to see, that could devastate the business. And so I continue to reach out and get involved in other series as much as humanly possible. And while some will say it's better to specialize in one area, that's the goal of some, is to just become a specialist in one specific area. Staying with, for example, IndyCar, I saw that as a recipe for disaster. And so reaching out and establishing relationships with drivers and teams from amateur and professional racing series really is what put us where we are now, which is kind of the first, when people think of the fitness training for motorsports, our name tends to come up more often than not.
Absolutely, absolutely there as well, Jim. And I could see that Jim might have disconnected here as well. I'm wonder as well, George, if it might be that he has an iPhone and maybe it's auto locking after 5 minutes. 'Cause I think I had that issue as well when I had to kind of use my phone for a couple of episodes, and if I didn't have the iPhone set on not like auto lock after 5 minutes, it would just automatically kind of shut me out of the recording. But either way, we'll style it out as we always do, bombastically here on Stripping the Dipping. And again, I think it's just really insightful. And the kind of next question I wanted to ask Jim as well, when he's back, is just the magic behind PitFit and its success as well. Because obviously we mentioned earlier the expansion in Charlotte, which is absolutely huge, as well as that they've had an expansion in England as well, which I think is really cool and something I'll probably look into for future years where I look to try and compete in, series as well. But, like being a leader in motorsport human performance as well, I was just keen to kind of know what makes their facilities and training regimes so special. Is there like one-to-one tuition between, the drivers and like the coaches as well? It makes it a bit more of a bespoke experience. On top of that as well, we heard from Sabra, that they had state-of-the-art technology, and that really enables athletes to kind of like, kick on their physical and mental well-being to the next level too. So really interesting to get Jim's perspective on that as well. Hi there, Jim.
Are we good?
Yeah, I think we're good. We're good. So, Jim, like whilst you're away there, I was just kind of setting the scene and like alley-ooping the next question and such. So, kind of leading into the next one as well, Jim, like we really wanted to kind of ascertain the magic behind PitFit, and its success, because we talked about the Charlotte expansion, which is absolutely huge, and also PitFit being able to reach a country like the UK as well and England. But, being kind of a leader in motorsports, human performance, could you give us a description of what the facilities are like, what the training regimes are like as well? Is it such a thing where you've got like a one-to-one bespoke kind of like training plan that's worked out for the athlete and the coaches? And just generally as well, what are the features like in terms of technology and emphasis on nutrition? What is it that's so special about PitFit that enables athletes to kick their physical and mental health to the next level?
I wholeheartedly believe that our single-minded focus on motorsports is what sets us apart from really anyone else who's participating in this kind of business. We have recruited so many experts that can help us that maybe aren't specialists in motorsports, but we can see there's an aspect of what they do in their specialty that we can curtail to motorsports. We have a lot of people on our team that come from all sorts of lines of work, from sleep, sports psychology, neurocognitive training. There's so many areas, mental training for depression. I mean, all these areas that we try and really stay on top, be the cutting edge. And for sure, the one thing that we've been known for quite some time, and I don't know if it's my inability to take, I won't take no for an answer, and I don't have any fear of failing, is just trying new concepts um, without any fear of being judged. I think that's that unfortunately I think is what hinders many experts in various fields is they're so concerned about how they'll be viewed by their peers as opposed to how it will benefit their client or their customer. And if you get too wrapped up in, you can say, looking silly because of something, at the end of the day, looking silly sometimes works just as well as looking serious. And it's all about the results. So, my inability to have any fear whatsoever of being judged for trying something new has kept us continuing to climb the ladder to the clouds in this field because we're the most innovative group in the world at what we do, and we get copied a lot, and I think that's flattering, and I think it's fantastic if it helps other drivers and they're not involved with us, but it still helps other drivers. I think it's great, and for me, I guess I'm in a position now, having done this for so long, that I wouldn't say we don't have any competition, but we're so thick in this field with our business that I would rather have good relationships with those doing what we do and learn together than being competitive like a car company who lives to see their competitors fail. That's not what I want to see, because essentially if our competitors fail, then we're failing the sport of motorsports.
Mm-hmm.
We can't train all the drivers. We can't make all the drivers safe for what we do. We can't rehab all the drivers. There's no way that we can do that. But I think if we encourage others to take this field up, and I've seen since I've gotten started, there's a plethora of physios and trainers and those that are doing this, and I think that's fantastic. I'm excited about the growth.
Absolutely there, Jim. And as you mentioned as well, I think PitFit really has laid down the foundation, and they've been fundamental and foundational to the blueprint of this kind of growing progressive nature of, like, fitness and well-being, and kind of getting the drivers as sharp and, as prepared as they'll ever be, for a competitive season of racing. And as you mentioned there too, in that kind of development as a company, you always have competitors and people that will, try and copy and imitate the things they like. But for your company to be doing so well, to be at the top, to be, to have so many links and the plethora of experience and, like, professional people that you have working there as well, that are experts in their own rights as well, I think can only be a benefit, and a huge kind of assistance to the drivers, which are obviously a beneficiary to the services that you can offer.
I agree. You really have to look at this sport. We've put much more emphasis in the last, I'd say, 5 years on a very holistic approach to what we do. It's not just the physical training for what they do. We were kind of at the forefront of the neurocognitive training aspect of reaction training and neurocognitive training under stress, that kind of a thing. And now you see, we invested in the equipment. And so this has become very common. And you see this, you see the companies coming out and there's more and more of this stuff available, and it's just a natural progression. But the thing that we've really started to latch onto is looking at a much more wellness approach for the driver, looking at their mental health, having professionals available to meet with them and speak with them if there's problems going on, monitoring some of their vital signs when they're sleeping, and looking at some of the data to show that there is an issue going on with them, whether it's recovery, whether it's mental strain from, who knows, a bad relationship, driving, parents, all these things. The approach of really trying to benefit these drivers and seeing them more as part of a family than just a client. That is something we've really been pushing more and more in the last few years. And this was a little bit before you started seeing the emphasis from racing on the mental health of drivers. We were doing that we were doing that before that, but probably once it became public knowledge that the drivers are mentally having some problems at times, then we definitely ramped that up. And since we've done that, we've had, I can't tell you how, obviously I can't tell you who, but so many drivers that we've sent to work with our therapists and individuals and parents, that kind of a thing, and really helped some of these drivers with getting things straight in their mental health. That's certainly been something I'm very proud that we've been able to pursue.
Absolutely, Jim. And I think the work that you do, you can be so proud of as a company, as a collective, because in this day and age as well, like only now are people kind of seeing the importance of, mental well-being and just how kind of athletes as well, they're like humans, like everybody else, and they have their ups
Right.
and they also have their downs as well. So it's key to kind of hear that as well and to see this whole how organically it plays out between, the staff at PitFit and also like, the drivers and the team members as well when it comes to building
Sure.
that organic relationship. Absolutely. And
Yeah.
absolutely, Jim. And one other question as well, to kind of link it into another aspect of the training that you do, we talk a lot about, the drivers and obviously the physical demands that are on them, but also another thing that we often overlook is the pit crew, to deliver flawless stops consistently. And, even this in some of the research that I've done as well, leading up to this kind of episode, I was watching a NASCAR documentary following the life of a driver called Bubba Wallace, number 23, that also signed
Sure.
a new contract. So congratulations to
Yes, he
him.
did. Yes, he did.
But they touched, I think, on one of the episodes on just like how they've taken some ex-American football players or students, even to take on the endeavor as being part of the pit crew team and changing the tires and doing the very tough and rigorous role that's involved, in being a pit crew member as well. Taking that into consideration as well, Jim, like how does training look, for the pit crew in terms of keeping them primed and ready to go? And also to kind of double barrel the question, Jim, is there like an advantage of hiring like ex college level athletes that have already like a pre-existing build physically in the nature of this kind of role?
Well, the dilemma that occurs with this situation is such. Here it is. When you look at a NASCAR pit crew and you look at an IndyCar pit crew, they're very different. In a NASCAR pit crew, the mechanics that work on the car aren't the guys aren't on the pit crew. The pit crew that does a pit stop, all they do is change tires. That's all they do. They will hire a lot of former college athletes. They'll pay them six figures. The money is amazing. They have all they do is train. They have full time strength coaches and whole programs and gyms at these massive facilities just for the pit crew. It's more physical than IndyCar because they have to run around the car and manually jack the car up, and so they do need better athletes. IndyCar is different in the fact that the same individuals that are working on the car are doing the pit stops for the most part. So you end up not really being able to attract the same type of individual because they have to have a mechanical background.
Sure.
They have to be mechanic first, and then they also learn how to do pit stops. So it's a little different. The population is a little older, and there's less emphasis on the pit stops. I think in regard to NASCAR, there's massive emphasis on that. IndyCar, it's also very important, but they realize that they have to do the best they can. But again, these are the individuals that are also working, getting up and being at the track early and being at the shop late, to make the car go, so to speak.
Absolutely, and also just to kind of touch on to a bit more as well there, Jim, like how does the training regime look like for the pit crew, in terms of getting them physically in condition for this? Because like I could only imagine you've got a car hurtling towards you at like 70 kilometers an hour, and then all the heat of the brakes, lifting the tires as well. It is quite physically demanding. And I know as like a
Right.
spectator when we look at them, we're like, oh, why didn't they do a 3 second stop? Why didn't they like do a 2 second stop? You know, and there's always that
Right, right.
frustration. But you know, like for them, can you talk about the challenges they go through and also mentally how they bounce back? You know, from let's say like a lackluster kind of like pit stop, or one where physically, you know, they've done the things that they should have done in terms of lifting the car up, you know, getting the tires on there, but then something mechanically has gone wrong with the wheel gun, and then mentally it's put them in kind of a nervous state where now, you know, they're not too confident for the next row of stops that will come up in the race
Sure.
inevitably.
I mean, that kind of situation is their training is a little bit different in the fact that you've got an older population. You can't train them like a college athlete because if they get injured, then not only can they not do pit stops, they may not even be able to do their job.
Mm,
So the training is going to be physical. There's they do the same strength training, a lot of the same training as a NASCAR crew would. Um, we focus heavily on their wellness as well. We make sure that we have chiropractors and athletic trainers and such that are around at the track and that can look after these individuals. And so the training it's intense, but I think you have to curtail it to your population. If you've got a population where 4 of the 6 crew members are over 40, it's a pretty good chance that they're not going to be able to last as long as one of these young 22-year-old kids who is just new at it and seems to bounce back from everything. You have to kind of curtail the training to your population. And there's, it's challenging, but we really can't afford to have the individuals injured.
sure.
With NASCAR, they're training basically Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, maybe Thursday, and they fly out, go to the track, do their pit stops, and they're done. That's it. That's all they have to do all day. So they're much more like a professional athlete in the fact that they're spending all week just preparing for the event, whereas from the physical side of it, whereas the IndyCar crew members are preparing the car and themselves at the same time. And, when push comes to shove, to have the car prepared, it's more important to have a car prepared than the crew member because you can't drive the car without a functioning car.
Sure.
So, schedules get in the way, and the off season for us is a good time to regenerate with things, with the crew members. But it's a challenging schedule. NASCAR is obviously a little bit different in the fact that they are starting now. You see them rotating people going to the track so that you don't go every single race weekend, but they have the staffing to do that. There's a huge number of individuals wanting to get into NASCAR, and so they do a fantastic job of making sure that these individuals were, there's 36 races or so a season. That's a lot of travel. So theirs is a little bit different. They have more manpower to switch people in and out than IndyCar does.
Absolutely there, Jim. And you know, I think it's fascinating just for like us as the listener as well to see the perspectives of how different those two sports are as well in terms of, you know, kind of like balancing the fatigue that, you know, the staff will experience throughout the course of the race weekend. Like you
Sure.
mentioned there as well. In IndyCar, the nature of the sport means that, you know, the mechanics are often the engineers also are working on the car and of an older kind of like generation. So in terms of the training for them, it's a bit more tailored towards them and their age group, and you know, this kind of the nature of what they do, and not kind of pushing them so hard because, you know, they might not be able to fulfill, you know, one of the other functions that they do. And also, like you mentioned, for the NASCAR guys, a bit more thoroughbred, a bit more kind of hands-on because it's a younger kind of like group of guys doing the pit stops as well. But also with them, it's like having that rotation, so you know, nobody gets worn out, and you know,
Sure.
people's kind of like lives and kind of like lifespans as well in that field can be extended. So really
Right.
intriguing.
Yeah, taking care of your employee in racing has definitely stepped up in the last few years. You see that teams and series are looking at the wellness of the people that make things work, and teams have done the same thing. I think that's a step in the right direction versus the old days when you just there was less emphasis on that, and people wore out a lot sooner. Hopefully, we can increase the longevity of individuals in racing. That's one of the objectives.
Absolutely, there, Jim, and I agree. And like motorsport as well, it has such a fruitful career for people. If they can continue to keep themselves in the right condition, but also the sport comes together as an organization and kind of gives them a career for them to enable that. So I absolutely agree. And
Yeah.
talking about like health and well-being as well, there, Jim, another kind of controversial topic we've seen in the F1 world. But I'll kind of get your perspective on. Oop, I think we lost Jim. But whilst we try and reestablish a connection, another thing I wanted to kind of touch on as well is in F1 we saw a lot of noise during the season about like drivers not having access to drinks bottles during the race due to the name of saving weight and regaining performance. But as far as Leo is concerned, I was just interested to see like whether he feels from his perspective, does fans are justified to be so alarmed about drivers not having access to drinks bottles, or and also kind of from a kind of like fitness and well-being perspective too, how like damaging can that be long term for an athlete, if they're not like being able to take on fluids actively, throughout the course of a very intense Grand Prix, but or whether it's the case as well as to whether or not drivers can survive the challenges. So I believe we got Jim back there. Jim, can you hear us? We'll wait for him to come back so Georgina can edit this segment absolutely tidily, like she did my blooper the other day. I'll never forget.
Should I be laughing?
Maybe. But that was really interesting as well, though, Georgie, just to kind of see even in IndyCar and NASCAR, like, how different the approaches are. And actually, like, NASCAR have like specific guys that just do the wheels and tires and stuff like that. Whereas IndyCar, probably because of budget, probably just due to the nature of like how many people you can have at a team, for one team as well. Like there's a thing where like most of the mechanics that do the suspension, do the
Hello.
setup and stuff like that as well. Back, Jim, I think you're back.
That was me. I clicked on something on my computer and I completely canceled you. Sorry about that.
No worries there, Jim. No worries at all. Well, actually, like I was just kind of segueing it anyway, but it'd be great to kind of get your perspective on this as well. Like setting the scene in F1, we've heard a lot of noise throughout the season about drivers not having access to drinks bottles, throughout the duration of a race, all in the
Right.
name of saving weight and trying to regain performance as the cars are in a new phase, got new regulations, and engineers are literally pushing the boundaries of what they can get away with in terms of weight savings. The question for you, Jim, was, as the spectators kind of raise concerns and things like that, do you think that they have a right to be like alarmed or kind of like, very skeptical about that? Or in this day and age as well, like, can modern drivers kind of survive the constraints, of not being able to take on, like fluids during a very long and draining, Grand Prix?
Well, I think it's sad that that's even an opportunity for a team these days.
Mhm.
I remember years ago there was a lot of controversy about F1 drivers, shedding weight to be as light as possible in the car and eating disorders and that we dealt with that in karting where we had coaches having 12-year-old kids starving themselves and the parents going along with it because it would make them lighter in the cart, obviously. And that was such a difficult thing to deal with. And I had spoken out years ago that Formula One should take the lead and find some sort of avenue to limit the ability to save weight with the driver from the driver. That the driver should be as light, as heavy as they need to be fit to drive the car. And so that eventually happened, and now that they're able to limit the weight in the car through the drink system, the downside of that is going to be decreased performance from just the pure fact that when your body isn't hydrated, your ability to the muscles aren't working properly, your brain is vastly filled with water, so to speak, and the ability for neurocognitive movements to take place are going to be diminished. I think it's a real safety issue that they're able to do that, along with the fact that you have incredibly hot and humid conditions at some races where not only are you overheated, but now the body basically uses energy to try to cool the core down. Using energy requires fuel. When there's no fluid to help with that energy production, you have a problem where you have an overheating driver, and there's potential for serious heat illness that could be long term. So I think it's a sad situation that they're able to circumvent the system and sacrifice the safety and health of the driver. I don't know what the answer is to that, but I think it's a really bad idea.
Of course, there, Jim. And, I think it's really good as well that kind of your kind of analysis and explanation there is in line with some of the concerns that a lot of spectators have raised throughout the season too, because it's kind of a nice segue into the next question I was going to ask, but just on the general speak of it, we're seeing, as you like mentioned earlier, that the careers of like the team and also the drivers is, increasing, and we're seeing drivers have a very long career in motorsports, which is what we always love to see as well. But then with things like that, as you mentioned, it can have long-term like damaging effects and repercussions on the athletes, which is not like ideal. And also as well, I don't think fair to them as well, because at the end of the day, like it's almost as if they don't have much of a choice.
Well, yeah, it's a competitive series, and yeah, I think it's difficult. I think that having younger drivers do this is a poor way to communicate how the sport should be run. But the FIA has to step up and dictate things. Obviously, the teams are going to do everything they can to win. We know Formula One, but there has to be some regulation, and some governing body has to step in and look at this aspect of it. Just weighing the drivers when they get out of the car, so they know what to take in. That's not going to help if someone has an incident, medical emergency in the car due to dehydration. It's not going to help them knowing what the weight is afterwards. It's already happened. And I feel like that's the next step that is going to happen. We'll have some sort of medical emergency with one of these drivers, and it's going to affect the outcome of the race, or affect the race for that driver, and then his health as well.
Absolutely there, Jim. And it, like you mentioned, it's sad that they'd rather take a reactive response there and wait for something to happen. Whereas, like, the knowledge and the tuition, that we can gain from people like you and the great guys at PITFIT as well, can give us insight into how important these things are, and that they're not to be taken for granted either. And like you mentioned as well, it's also kind of very saddening and distressing to even see that parents have got that idea from quite a young age too, with their kind of like kids, getting into the competitive elements of karting, and to even see it kind of play out there too. So, I mean, if you set an example from the top, it tends generally to kind of trickle down to the bottom as well, you'd think.
Well, and I think the thing that people have to realize, and our science director, David Ferguson from Michigan State University, his team did a research study not long ago where they monitored fluid loss and performance on a simulator with drivers, and they basically determined that basically all components of racing, from the muscular ability to reaction times to cognitive processing skills, are diminished the more fluid that is lost. And so when there's no actual benefit that's going to come out of it, I don't understand that. I know at times that a driver may, saving weight could be a benefit, but I think if you look at the driver's performance while they're in this state, I can't imagine you're going to see much benefit in the way of performance. I think it's just a silly way that, like I've said, someone needs to step in and regulate this, or else we're going to have some sort of catastrophe on our hands.
Absolutely, and it would be really tragic as well that it have to come to that, Jim. So, I'm really glad that you've, been very kind of vocal on that, and, people that are listening to this as well can kind of take that message on board too, because, you've got obviously the insight of obviously like a scientifical kind of background into it as well. And, you know,
Right.
you've seen the studies as well that kind of validate the kind of point that's being raised here as well. So thank you for that, you know. And to put on like a brighter note as well there, Jim, you know, you've had the opportunity to work with some phenomenal and talented drivers. You know, our other co-host, F1 Black, he's a huge Mark Blundell fan. So I'm sure he's probably going to be listening to
Oh,
this, shaking his head, just like, no, I missed it. How dare I miss it? But
yeah.
you know, just one of
Mark's
those
a great
things.
guy. Mark's a
Exactly.
great guy. Still see him once in a while, and know his kids a little bit, and yeah, there's a funny story with Mark. We were staying my first year. I was at the race at Road America, and the team didn't book me a hotel.
Oh no.
There's none available, and so Mark was staying, as do most of the drivers, at a place called the American Club, very posh resort in Kohler, Wisconsin, massive. And Mark said, "Hey, just stay with me, not a big deal. We'll get a pull-out bed." So, you know, we went to dinner, and you know, they brought up the bed, and you know, we both went to bed and everything, and he had the big bed and as he deserved. And then the next morning, I, you know, fold the bed up. I'm very tidy and neat. Fold the bed up, kind of put it behind the wall, getting things organized. And then he had called in for some juice and some breakfast. And so the waiter comes in. Mark gets out of the shower, nothing but a towel. I think I'm in my underwear. There's one bed, and the guy looked at both of us and just in shock. And we talked about that for the longest time, and I said, "Oh, the stories that are going to come out of that." So that was a funny story. The guy thought, "Well, these two blokes are together, and that's we're getting them coffee and tea for the morning."
Jim, you're probably very relieved that social media wasn't a thing back then.
Oh yeah, quite. I'd be very relieved if social media wasn't around today. Let me tell you.
I could imagine. There's just certain things that come on. It's like, where the hell did that come from?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, actually, kind of talking on that as well there, Jim, you know, like we're seeing the lifespan of drivers increase in motor racing, which is amazing. You know, this is kind of keeping it kind of topical. Like Kimi Raikkonen's announced that he's going back to NASCAR and has been doing a lot of kind of training and seat fittings for his team as well. Fernando Alonso is like, you know, one of the most competitive but oldest drivers on the grid at the moment too. And more relevantly, I actually wanted to bring this fella up because I know you've done a lot of work with him too. The Kiwi himself, Scott Dixon, you know, challenging this year for IndyCar World Challenge title as well, and still smashing a lot of legendary records too. The question is there, Jim, like, what's the secret to longevity in motor racing from the physical aspect? And what advice would you give to younger drivers looking to kind of race at the pinnacle of motorsport, but having the longevity in terms of physical and mental well-being?
Scott, we just had his birthday celebration finally last Friday. A big group of us at a pub here in town. You know, Scott is someone who, when we first started working together, the training wasn't really something he was into, but he embraced it. We spent a lot of time together. For him, you know, you find a competitive nature in him. With other drivers in his training, and in the areas that he feels are safe. He's not one that's going to try and have the heaviest bench press, because he realizes you know, a lot of bench pressing has potential damage detrimental to your shoulders. He's not going to want to lift the most weight in a squat rack because the potential for injury is very high. But other areas, he will definitely, the neurocognitive aspects, some of the cardiovascular machines, records, he'll always try and top some of the drivers. And I think that's kept him at the top for a long time. He finds that the value of his training has increased over time. He's as strong and fit as he is now as he has ever been, probably better now. He knows to take time off a little more now. You know, and I think a lot of drivers maybe don't have as much talent. They feel like if they just work harder and harder in the gym, reckless abandon, it'll benefit them in the car. And we monitor vital signs on drivers. We monitor their sleep. Their training program is regimented in cycles so that there is rest periods built in, recovery workouts, just like with any professional athlete. And my advice for that's how Scott has stayed on top of his game, and a lot of our drivers are in the same boat. For younger drivers, I think that's just the idea. You've got to take it serious to the point how it benefits you in the car. If you get too honed in on one particular area, for example, if you aspire to be the best triathlete, that's great. But where are you lacking? If you're triathlon training all the time, where's your strength training? Where's your neurocognitive training? Are you training the neck or the grip? So you have to be specific to the sport and train for the sport, not the training activity you pursue. Weightlifting, if you're getting big and bulky and strong, that's great, but what's that do to your mobility? So I mean, that's my my advice to young drivers is be smart about your training, be diverse in what you do, but you definitely need to take an effort to step that up, or else you're going to find yourself one day your talent will only go so far. And that's what you have to realize is talent will only take you so far. You've got to keep your physical side and your mental status as high as possible as well.
I absolutely agree there, Jim. And I think us talking about Scott Dixon there as well is just a really great kind of example there. Because as you mentioned, maybe he was somebody that didn't love it to begin with in terms of trying to get into the fitness aspect of it and keeping himself sharp. But even like a multiple acclaimed champion like him could appreciate the value of where it could add to his performances. And even now these days, you see that, he's not getting younger, but at the same time as well, he's able to use his brain and hone his kind of focus on areas which are going to keep him super sharp and at the front of the grid as well. And we saw it with that crazy race the other day in Nashville where, again, physically, you could say mentally there was a fatigue on the drivers because they had the restart delayed with all the thunderstorms and stuff like that. So what they probably expected to be a race start at maybe 5 o'clock didn't start until 7 o'clock. Then it was a kind of race plagued by a load of cautions just due to the nature of the circuit. It's like a street circuit, so there's a lot of emphasis on trying to drive as closely to the walls and maintaining focus at the same time without losing control of the car. And then again, towards the end of the race, just he was able to still capitalize on other people's mistakes and kind of pace himself as he's trying to pick up the positions, one by one until he was literally leading the race and then defending against a very hard charging Scott McLaughlin too. So again, just to see him as one of the older drivers on the grid still doing it, still he surpassed our boy Mario Andretti in terms of one of the most winningest drivers in the sport too, and still looks like he's on target to try and catch AJ Foyt as well. I think it's incredible. And like you said, for the younger kind of listeners and the younger athletes too, if they can take that on board and not just solely rely on talent, but then not solely just rely on physical ability, then I think they can kind of hone a nice combination of both of those things together.
Absolutely.
So true. And then we've got a really interesting fan question as well there, Jim, which I'd be so kind of keen to get your take on too. Is there such thing as a genetic or biological disadvantage in relation to motor racing? So let's kind of flesh this one out a bit more as well, Jim. We see in some racing series that they're really tall or just naturally muscular drivers. I'll take Joseph Newgarden as an example, Penske driver. I can also take maybe George Russell, a very lanky, kind of almost 6-foot driver that wears size 10 boots and struggled to really fit into Lewis Hamilton's car at that time. He stood in for him when Lewis had COVID. Would you say that there's really a physical disadvantage for athletes like them? And how do they overcome, trying to overcome those kind of disadvantages in terms of their build size or even height?
Well, I think it's relevant to the series they're in. For example, Joseph is extremely strong, very fit, and I think that benefits him tremendously in the car. As far as his height, I don't think he's that tall. I don't know what he's maybe 6 foot or so. I think as long as you can, because those cars are physically difficult to drive. You have to
Sure.
be very, very strong. So the more muscle that you have, the more upper body strength, it's critical you have that to be successful. In Formula One, it's vastly different in the fact that, the higher the center of gravity in the car for an F1 driver, because the grip is so amazingly strong. And the center of gravity, the higher the center of gravity, the more stress it's going to be on the core of the body. Someone like a George Russell, that height is going to create more of a challenge. Whereas someone lower centered, you're not going to have that same issue. But you also don't need the muscle, the strength in Formula One that you need in IndyCar. The cars have power steering. They're very different animals, ironically. And we just had Colton Herta test at Barcelona, or sorry, at
I think it was Portimao. Yeah, in Portugal.
Yeah, we were at Portugal, and it was a major concern. I know I've been friends with Zach Brown for a long time, and we spoke, and he was very, very much made it very clear that his physical fitness in the car needed to be on top, including his neck. And that was critical. We tell this to young drivers all the time, the last thing you want to do is have your fitness be a detriment to your testing in a car. That means you're not committed. And I think, Pato O'Ward is a tremendous talent, phenomenal young driver. When he tested Abu Dhabi the year before, he even admitted his fitness was not where it needed to be. His neck, he basically, after the morning session, his neck was shot, and the rest of the day was a bit of a waste. And so we had that kind of the fear driven into us. And so Colton's training, we had to maintain his training for IndyCar, but we also had to bump up his neck training for F1. We were both pleasantly surprised that he didn't feel it was as challenging as people had said it was going to be. His neck was fine. It was a little sore when he got to Toronto, a little tired, but nothing detrimental. His strength was good. His fitness was good. And Colton is probably a little bit shorter than Joseph, not quite as muscular, a little more lanky, but he was fine in the car. So I do think that the F1 drivers, their upper body strength doesn't need to be as heavy as it does for IndyCar drivers. And most drivers coming from Europe who come over here, Christian Lundgaard or Callum Ilott, the first thing that got to get stronger. Like that's the first thing they do. They have very little upper body muscle, and the Indy cars are a beast to drive on a lot of tracks. So that's the first thing we do is we add weight to them. Alex Rossi put on probably 20 pounds from when he drove an F1 to when he came over here to where he is now, just in muscle to be where he is in IndyCar.
Absolutely, and it's interesting as well just to get insight into how different the kind of mindsets are for each kind of discipline, because each requires its own kind of unique training and an emphasis on certain like attributes or things you really need to focus on as well. So it's really fascinating to hear that too. And also, Jim, whilst we have you as well, like we've talked about kind of biological or kind of genetic kind of like aspects of a driver and how they'll use that either to their advantage or work around the disadvantage it could have. But another thing I wanted to touch on as well and circle the block on is you talked about the very talented, Robert Wickens. And, I imagine for most of our listeners, they won't need an introduction to him because most of the motor racing guys that check out this podcast know of like Robert Wickens. But, to the more casual listeners, Robert Wickens is such an amazing driver. He participated in DTM and had success with that. He obviously was part of the Renault 3.5 series as well, did GP3. Sure. He's done IndyCar. He's a very kind of like well-rounded driver that unfortunately, his career took kind of a different path when he had a very life-changing incident at the Pocono kind of race circuit, which left him, partly paralyzed. Could we talk on that as well, Jim? And just like, he's part of obviously Brian Herta's Autosport team now in kind of racing in the Michelin Pilot Sport Challenge Series 2. For a driver like him that has those kind of physical limitations through like a life-changing accident, How does training look for somebody like him, and how do you go about kind of tailoring the training for somebody like him as well?
Well, I've known Robert since 2004 when he drove Formula BMW. For BMW here in the States, we were in charge of that aspect of it, and so him and Graham Rahal and James Hinchcliffe and such. I worked with a lot of those drivers then, and then worked with him when he drove it was then called the Toyota Atlantic Series. And he'd been selected as a Red Bull driver at that point. And then he, went over and did career in DTM. And when he came back here, we began working with him. Kind of the same thing. We ramped up his strength a lot. He was pretty lean and lanky. I definitely, the drivers who have never had a chance to gain muscle and eat love it, because it's wonderful. Their bodies look better, and they get to eat a little more, and they feel better. That's critical. And so when Robert had his accident, obviously there was a period there. In the beginning, we were involved with his rehab at the hospital flew out to Colorado. He's in a rehab center that we're really not set up to do everything they were doing. But when he came back here, we worked closely with him on the initial phase was to, try to get him to walk. And so we had a lot of equipment that we ended up getting a hold of, stim systems and things like that were, utilized with his training to get him to walk. And but it went well, and we made some progress, and everything was moving. But at some point, it was quite apparent that was it. There's a certain point where the body just will shut down. The nerve pathways have finished the recovery process that they're going through. There is no magic potion. It's basically, this is what you've got. And, sure. That's kind of where we were. But then as soon as we knew after his test in Mid-Ohio, in another driver's car that has a similar condition, we knew that this thing with Brian was probably going to happen. So we started ramping up his training, and then his training switched back to racing driver. We had to do the same cardiovascular training, the same strength training, all those areas, but everything had to be adapted to what we could do with him. We have a lot of equipment here, thankfully, because we do so much work with muscular body endurance, or upper body muscular endurance. We have so much equipment that we use with our drivers regularly. This was perfect for Robert. So we had a lot of equipment already that he could, and we just modified a lot of his things to suit what his needs were. And, he'll be in tomorrow morning actually as well. His neurocognitive training, the equipment can be adapted to work with him. We just continue to evolve that. But we continue to be conscious of the fact that there's areas of his body that we have to be conscious of, and we still do a lot of treatment work with him. But he's as strong as any other driver on the circuit with his upper body, for sure. He's really taken to it. And Robert I didn't realize how much of a perfectionist Robert was until I started carrying him in and out of the car, and had to go down and spend an entire day, multiple days, practicing pit stops, driver changes where I had to pick him up and carry. It's exhausting for a guy my age, but he is a perfectionist. He's a professional, and he sees a bright future for him moving. I think he's wanting to get back into prototypes and everything. So he's an amazing individual.
I absolutely agree with you, Jim. And it's so amazing just to see that fighting spirit from him as well. Because you mentioned, all of the earlier success he had in his kind of career, from the Formula BMW days all the way onwards. And obviously now he's had this kind of setback. But we've seen it with other drivers too. For example, Alex Zanardi as well have a life-changing kind of crash too, and then try and find the kind of physical rehabilitation and gradually work up from different series to series to kind of just get back to that kind of pinnacle they were at before. And of course, it's never the same. There's always limitations or things that you have to do differently. But in a way, I guess it almost forces you to kind of find new kind of barriers, find new kind of things that you can push to kind of like regain performance in areas you probably wouldn't have considered before.
Right. Well, for sure. We've learned so much. We've worked with the rehab of drivers for as long as I've been in this business. We've rehabbed drivers from Dario Franchitti to, I mean, the list is all over the world with the number of drivers. And that's simply because the doctors, they know in most cases a conventional physical therapist is going to follow a protocol that is not specific to the patient they're dealing with, like a race car driver. And so it's going to be long, it's going to be tedious, but during that time, the rehab of the injured area, what we do, we work with the rehab side of the injured area, but then we also are continuing to train the uninjured areas of the body because, we don't want to get to the point where, for example, a knee is rehabbed and ready to go, but then the rest of the body's been let go. We simultaneously try to work with the rehabilitation of the driver under a doctor's care, of course, and continue to focus on the other areas of the body and the mind that the driver needs to have. So when the driver's injury is where it needs to be, they're ready to go. We've done this over and over and over again. And the drivers are, if anything, drivers like James Hinchcliffe, for example, if anything, they get these injuries and we have to slow them down because they're so competitive. They feel more is better. And that's not always the case. And it ends up, you can have a setback if that's the case. Will Power broke his back years ago and worked with him. And, luckily we keep a tight lid on, what they're able to do, but sometimes they'll go off on their own and extend themselves a little too much. And most of the time it bites them in the ass. And, they'll feel a twinge, they'll feel something, and we get to scold them and then tell the doctor on them. And then they realize, okay, maybe they know what they're talking about, but the drivers, most of the time, they feel like they can do more than what we're prescribing for them. And most times they can't. We push them to their limits already.
Of course, and in that kind of sense as well, Jim, I think it almost makes them kind of believe more in you guys and to kind of see that you guys do have like their best interests at heart as well. And actually, you're trying to work with them rather than against them as well to get them to a level they need to be, but, in a very healthy and kind of, sensible manner too, rather than, trying to really push the envelope and running the risk of them getting injured again.
Right. It's critical, but, it can be done properly, and we try always to do the best we can, and it seems to be working.
Absolutely. And another fan question we've gotten in as well, Jim. I don't know how you can answer this, maybe more in a general sense, since I feel it's still a kind of gray taboo area kind of in motor racing, but I'll put it forward anyway to you, Jim. Like, the question is, how does banned substances like help racing drivers when in other kind of like sports or competitive things like bodybuilding, we understand like, the connection between how those, substances can potentially be performance enhancing. But in a racing context, how would it necessarily help the driver if they were using substances they shouldn't be?
Obviously, it depends on the substance. Anything that creates enhancement in an endurance sport, whether it's EPO or blood doping or so many different options in there, it can have a benefit in racing, I suppose. The benefit would have to come in training. And from any kind of growth hormone or steroid or along those lines, you'll see enhanced strength, maybe enhanced recovery would be another. But, other than something that would accelerate the driver's ability to react, which I think you would get some, say, from like a caffeine drug, there's a drawback to those things as well. So I don't really know of too many. We've never really come across anything performance enhancing that will benefit a driver. You hear about alcohol, for example. with Olympic biathletes, the cross country skiing and then shooting,
Mhm.
they'll take sips of alcohol because it tends to kind of calm them down and give them a bit of a tunnel vision. But there's obviously there's a limit to how much of that you want to do with consuming alcohol, and they're only skiing and shooting targets. They're not driving a race car 200 miles an hour. So I don't know of anything that I would consider to be beneficial in the way of performance enhancing drugs. I could see using an IV between sessions to enhance the recovery from dehydration. But beyond that, we've not encountered really anything. And from a banned substance standpoint, the list is there's a lot of things on there that we would never even, at least with IndyCar, that we would never even consider using. So I don't really see the the benefit of anything unless it's going to help with recovery, and that's about the only reason I could see for any kind of performance enhancement.
Oh, okay, Jim. I mean, it's interesting to kind of see, and how in a way like motorsport is unique in that sense too, because you mentioned it might not be like the performance behind the wheel per se, but actually, kind of the aftermath of it all and the kind of recovery pace of the driver as well, which is key because we see in some motorsport series as well, they've got back-to-back races, or kind of
Right.
like in some cases like double kind of races where they've got like a sprint and then a full Grand Prix the following day.
Well, absolutely, and races like we have the Iowa race where it's a double header, and that's a very physical track, and they'll do 2 races in the span of 2 days. Very hot, very challenging, and so a lot of emphasis is placed on hydration prior to the first event, nutrition and recovery after the first event, and obviously hydrating properly and being prepared for the next event. So that's where really the training comes in. The more physically prepared a driver is going into a race like that or the season, the less of the chance of them having issues in the car. And also as the season wears on, if the program is followed properly, the driver will have less wear and tear in the body, and they'll still maintain that level of fitness at a high level throughout the entire season, where someone who doesn't train during the season, just racing is not going to keep you in shape, unfortunately.
Absolutely there, Jim. And one final fan question we've had as well before we get into wrapping up the show as well there, Jim, is one of the fans have asked us, what did the drivers actually drink during the race? Is it like an isotonic drink, or is there something else that gives them the kind of the replenishment and also the nutrients as well whilst they're still behind the wheel?
I think drivers have their own drinks. Some will use, well, there's various drink companies out there. We created a formula with a company out of Cincinnati, about 5 different formulas a couple years ago that is a more of an isotonic drink, easily absorbed, all natural products, with a company called Infinite Nutrition. And then, so we basically with them, we designed with their dietitians, we have a formula that is higher in sodium for very, very hot days, and a lot of our pit crews will use that as well. And then there's another one that's a lower calorie carbohydrate drink. Then there's a higher calorie for a longer race. We have a night blend, which has caffeine in it, and then a women's blend, which is very similar to the low calorie, but it's just less harsh taste. And so these are all kind of specific to what each driver needs. We have a lot of our drivers will use that. Some are using SOS Rehydrate. Scott, I think, Dixon uses that. I don't know of all the companies that are out there, but really it's just a long chain carbohydrate drink that is not going to be too high in simple sugars, not like a Gatorade or something like that digests easily. And some just go with water. I mean, some just use water in the car. So it just depends on what. Some have digestive issues. It just depends on the drivers. Usually they'll figure this out. Years ago, they figured out what works best for them, and they stick with it.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's just interesting as well to just get that level of insight too, because as you mentioned, for each athlete, it's always slightly unique, and but as something I didn't even consider there as well is like the digestive system of the driver too, and
Right.
kind of what they can kind of take, what they probably can't pilot at the time, and stuff like that too. So it's really insightful to see that, Jim. And kind of the final question, Jim. You always like to round these podcasts off on a really funny or really intriguing note. Like if somebody came to the house and they just pointed, let's say, a water pistol at you, because we don't promote violence here on stripping the dipping. It's a water
Yeah.
pistol. And they say, Jim, like, who are your top 3 drivers that you most enjoyed working with? And I know you gave us the funny kind of Mark Blundell story, but if there was another funny or memorable story you could give our audience,
There's
what would you say?
many funny stories that I probably wouldn't want to repeat at this. Not until I retire. It's kind of hard to say. I've had so many drivers of all levels that have come through our program and become close to. I think, and it's great to see these young drivers who we've worked with since they were very young, and now they're at the top levels, and we've been part of their career. I think some entertaining drivers. I've worked with Paul Tracy. Never a dull moment with him. He lived out in Vegas when I was working out with. I'd go out there and work with him, and invariably we would end up at a club at night. That was just what you did, I guess, in Vegas, and that wasn't really ran counter to the program I was trying to run. Al Unter, always a good story or two there. Some of them I can't really repeat. A lot of them are with Scott Dixon, I will admit, and those I definitely can't repeat, or as his wife might listen to this podcast, and we might have some issues. Yeah, I don't know. Golly, I'm looking at my wall here of drivers that we've had fun with. I don't know, man. I'm sorry. I can't really think of anything. I remember. No, can't say that one. Sorry. Once I start thinking of the story, then I realize who's involved, and maybe that this time of day, in this day and age, that's not appropriate. So we don't want to do that. But
Sure.
yeah, I mean, I'd have to think that one through. It's just, I remember a funny story where Paul Morris, Australian driver, was teammates with Didier Andre at PacWest Racing Indy Lights, and Paul called the dude, really funny, great guy, Australian supercar driver, teaching Didier, who didn't speak English that well, how to swear.
Oh no.
And not explaining when it was appropriate, when it wasn't. So he would blurt these things out at random times, and it wasn't appropriate. I can't even the F-bomb here and there, and I guess having a good time at the Chili Bowl with Scott Dixon a few years ago when we all had a few cocktails and we were there as fans, and Scott had so much fun that he ended up hanging out with fans, and the fans couldn't believe that Scott Dixon was sitting in the stands with them watching the Chili Bowl, and people loved that. And that was a little bit before social media hit too heavy. Nothing bad happened, but it was just entertaining to see that Scott Dixon, this representation of IndyCar and the perfect statesman for the sport, just letting loose at a race with the fans. That was a good moment, actually.
I could imagine, Jim. He seems like such a he's almost like the uncle of IndyCar, I would say, in terms of how he presents himself, his mannerisms, his stories. He's always quite upbeat. Even when things don't go, to plan, you can always see that focus that he's already got his attention kind of diverted to next week and what he's going to do differently and how he's going to improve. And, I really love that about him too. As even somebody like me, I always, my dad used to watch a lot of IndyCar, especially when it was car back in the day. And now I'm trying to find alternative avenues and trying to encourage our listeners as well, to get into things like IndyCar, get into things like GT3 racing, etc., etc. you know, and you see these personalities on the grid as well, and some of them are so likable, you know, and some of them are really memorable. Some of them are memorable for the wrong reasons, as you mentioned
Yeah.
as well. So
I think Scott is an individual who doesn't think about himself first. I think that's what really ingratiates himself with people, is he's very interested in you. He understands his place in motorsports. He also has I think Emma, his wife, would chew him out if he did something improper or says something wrong. So she's been a great thing to have him around. And now that he's got the kids, you know, I've watched him grow up from a very reckless, kind of a wild young man to a great role model for not just drivers but people in general.
absolutely, Jim. You know, and that's the thing with like life as well. You know, we grow older, we mature, you know, we continue to evolve as people and to learn. And I think, like you said as well, like Scott's just such an embodiment of that in such a way as well, while still retaining like his this nature as a person and just like his quirks, you know, too. So yeah, man, like it's been so fun just to kind of watch him still up there being competitive and dicing it with the young boys as well and giving them stuff to think about.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
So true. Well, Jim, you know, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on this episode. And I feel that we need to revisit you and have you on the podcast again, hopefully maybe towards the end of the year or maybe at the start of the new season. You know, maybe we can get some very cool insight into like, you know, life as a driver before the season, kind of the stuff they'll be doing on the off season, the training camps and stuff like that too.
I think that'd be great. I mean, I love it. It's a chance for me to not think about work for a while and just kind of relive and talk for a bit. So I appreciate you having me on, and I would enjoy very much being back on again.
Jim, it would be our honor and pleasure as well. And we were really looking forward to that too. You're going to be a very popular star guest on this show as well, because the kind of knowledge you've put us onto and also just the nostalgia and stories you've given us as well are really memorable, you know, and kind of like, you know, engaging in that sense too. But Jim, before you go, just like, you know, could you shout out, you know, the PitFit crew and kind of where like young athletes or stars can reach out to you and the entire team as well?
Sure. I mean, really, just go to our website. You know, we're kind of evolving that with some changes slowly but surely. It's not a huge priority right now, but if you want to reach out to us, just go to our website, pitfit.com, and then you can email us from there. And you know, if you have questions or learn more about our program, certainly reach out, and you know, we'll definitely get back to you.
Absolutely, Jim. And as always, Georgina does a great and sterling job of putting out all the socials as well with these episodes as and when they come out too. So I'm sure you'll be getting a lot of inquiries and interest, you know, from other avenues, because it's just such an interesting thing to learn about. And I think, you know, people like you we can learn so much from people like you, man. And I'm so kind of honored, you know, to...
So
Sure.
What is this stripping the dipping? What is that all about?
Well, since we actually have the boss lady inside here, I'll let her explain it, since I wasn't the name of the show, so I'll let her do the honors.
So that was actually a name that I came up with like 5 seconds. When a person was asking me whether I have a name for the podcast or not, I just said stripping the dipping, because it's a meaning behind, like, okay, there are two things behind this name. The first one is when you say stripping, people actually get curious about it and then just, you know, come behind it and check it out. And the second one is it's like we are actually stripping through the whole motorsport, and we are trying to talk the topics and the sectors that often not spoken about, like the workload that you guys are doing and the workloads a trainer is doing, an engineer is doing, often won't be spoken that a lot. So it's like we are stripping out the whole deep and going deep and finding the true heroes behind it.
Okay. It's much more eloquent when you say it that way, I guess. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, Jim, you're a star. Thank you so much for joining us, man. And we're looking forward to bringing you back on again. And for our listeners as well, make sure that you go and follow the PitFit guys as well on all the socials. We'll definitely have them up there. And like it's been such an insightful episode too. We really have to be super thankful to Jim for his time because we know he's a busy guy, and the team are always working on the next star, the next kind of like face of motorsport of such. So it's great to to be able to link up with them and to kind of build a kind of connection with them too through this podcast. It means a lot to all of us. So until next time, guys, please stay fit, please stay healthy, continue doing the amazing work that you guys do, but don't work too hard. And until next time, it's been your usual co-host AMG Denz, coming out of Indiana and back to North London where I belong. But until next time, guys, take it easy. Peace.
Bye-bye.